Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 24 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. Now, in the last. Okay, first of all, we're going to go over the copyright information because that's the most important. Okay. Clearly, it says here Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. It's copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, all rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company Incorporated, a Random House company, and it gives the address. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited. Printed and bound in the United States of America, and this gives all the Library of Congress information and stuff like that, if that's what you're into. Now, we started last time a story called Death's Masquerade. And apparently the mask maker, Miro, was able to see who was going to die, basically because when he would make a mask, then he would imbue that with some of his mood and his emotion. And it seemed to be pretty accurate, actually. So, yeah. So we're going to find out. This Paul Garneau, something like that, is really interested in... So yeah, he's confronting this guy who basically fixes the lottery, and we're going to see what happens because this is really fascinating. One of these tickets should win the grand prize, said Paul, his tone deep and hollow from within the mask. So pay me and save us both trouble. Dizzard's response was a laugh that sounded like a bellow. Well, if everyone asks to be paid 100 to 1, nobody else will ask. They don't know the lottery is fixed. I'm only asking you to be honest, Dizzard, and declare an actual winner. Besides, I see the figure of death creeping up behind you. I can ward it off, Dizzard, by giving you these voodoo powders. He tossed some packets on the desk, which were especially prepared by Miro. Angrily, Dizzard brushed away the tickets and the packets and bellowed, "Get out of here. I see death closing in." From behind the mask, Paul's tone was ominously persuasive. "I see bony hands at your throat, Dizzard." Instinctively, Dizzard raised one hand to his throat, then reached for a desk drawer. With the other, Paul launched himself across the desk. "Let me help you, Dizzard. You are already in death's clutch. Let me pull those bony hands away." A consummate actor, Paul Garneau was pretending that he was fighting off a pair of deadly clutching hands, but Dizzard, also grabbing for the hands that gripped his own throat, found only Paul's there. Gradually, the struggling ended. Dizzard slumped dead. "Too bad," Paul said in a solemn tone. "I just did not have the strength to cope with death. It's death himself." In the desk drawer, Paul found the revolver that Dizzard had tried to reach. Also, he found $30,000 in cash, Dizzard's profit from the lottery. Paul, being honest, took only $10,000 for himself. Then he unlocked the back door of Dizzard's office and hurried down a back stairs to a courtyard that led to the Rue Dauphine. I wonder if that's Red Dolphin? I don't know. I don't know French. I'm sorry. But Dauphine is a lot like dolphin. And they found Dizzard's body an hour later, along with the scattered lottery tickets and voodoo powders. Because of the money left in the desk, it didn't look like a robbery at first. But during the weeks that followed, Detective Henry Blank of the New Orleans police finally eliminated all suspects except a man who had been wearing a Laughing Cavalier costume. At Miro's, Blanc found that Paul Garneau had purchased such a costume and that he had also bought the lottery tickets and the voodoo powders. Also, Paul had been losing so much money in his favorite gambling houses that it seemed quite likely he had taken cash from Dizzard's desk. as there was no other place where he could have gotten it. So, in due process, Paul was arrested, charged with the murder of Dizzard, and brought to trial. As a lawyer, Paul decided to take charge of his own defense. The odds in local gambling circles promptly rose to 20 to 1 against him. 21 against him. Okay. Okay, wait. Oh, here. Sorry, I was in the wrong paragraph. As a lawyer, Paul decided to take charge of his own defense. The odds in local gambling circles promptly rose to 20 to 1 against him, as the state was represented by Mark Zeman, the most capable prosecutor in Louisiana. Using evidence supplied by Detective Blank, the prosecutor traced every movement of the Lightning Cavalier from the time he left Miro's shop until he entered Dizzard's office. Z-Man was a big man with a broad, heavy, firm-set face, which always maintained the same glowering expression. While he boomed away in a domineering tone, he was at his best when he called Paul as a witness and demanded, "Can you, Paul Garneau, possibly deny that you were the last person to enter the office while Noel Dizzard was still alive?" Paul didn't deny it. Instead, he admitted it, which brought a gasp from the courtroom. Then, calmly, Paul related, "There was someone already in there with Dizzard when I entered. A weird, grotesque figure of death clutching Dizzard's throat from behind. I thought the attacker was some crazed masker, and I tried to wrench him away. Then suddenly he was gone, and there was Dizzard slumped on the desk. I decided the killer must have fled by the back door, which was open, so I followed, but by the time I reached the Rue Dauphine, he had vanished. I knew then that Death himself had taken my good friend Dizzard, so it was no use to go back." A highly imaginative story, sneered Z-Man. "It is just too bad that you cannot furnish witnesses to support such fanciful testimony." "But I can," Paul assured him. "First, I shall call on Carlotta Engard, a figure of death hovering over Dizzard, as she had with... Oh, wait. Carlotta took the stand and sincerely avowed that she had often seen a figure of death hovering over Dizzard, as she had with certain other persons who had died quite suddenly. Scoffingly, Z-Man declared that her unsupported testimony would not do. So Paul called the next witness, old Miro. Blandly, the mask maker told how he, too, had seen the Grim Reaper looming above Dizzard as well as other persons. Under cross-examination, Miro produced his little black book. When names were read from it, an odd hush fell over the jury until Z-Man turned to them and stormed, "All trumped-up evidence, all hearsay, all a trick. That book could have been faked to fit the case. Let's put this to a real test." He turned to Miro, who was seated placidly in the witness box. "Since you are so good at seeing death, look around the court and tell us where his figure is hovering now." That was an old trick which Paul had expected Z-Man to spring. Paul hoped Miro would respond in a way that would impress the jury, but he only shook his head. "I judge masks," Miro declared, "because their features are fixed. I cannot judge people because their features are mobile. Of course, there are a few people whose faces can be termed masks due to their fixed expression. And do you see any such faces in this courtroom now?" "A few, but they are not good examples except for your face." The judge silenced a ripple of nervous laughter from the courtroom. Paul Garneau leaned forward intently as Mark Z-Man suddenly demanded, "Then tell us, Miro, do you see a figure of death behind me?" Miro studied Z-Man as Paul had often seen him study customers in the costume shop. Then Miro began to nod slowly. "Since you ask me," he said, "I do. It is coming closer, closer." Miro turned to Carlotta, who was riveting in riveting in her chair. You see it too, don't you? Then, as Carlota hesitated, almost on the point of nodding, Miro stared at Z-Man and added, "Its fingers are clutching now." Contemptuously, Z-Man turned to the jury, gave them his fixed glower, and raised his hands to his throat. In stentorian tones, he boomed, "So, these witnesses see me in death's clutches, as Garneau claims. He saw Dizzard. Excuse me. They want us to believe that Dizzard raised his hands like this and struggled against bony fingers that were otherwise invisible. Do you see any hands but mine, gentlemen? Or of the jury, I can talk. Can you see the bony fingers of death?" Z-Man reeled momentarily as he spoke. A gargling cry sounded in his throat. His body came up to its full height, bending back as though drawn by invisible hands. Then the unseen grip apparently relaxed, for Z-Man toppled forward, hitting the front of the jury box and sprawling across it. Inert, while the jurors shied away, the court attendants came rushing in. The judge pounded with his gavel and called a recess. It proved to be a long one. Mark Z-Man was dead, and he had gone in the very manner that he had scoffed at as something impossible. He was gone, with death's invisible clutches upon his throat. The doctors pronounced it heart failure, and the trial was resumed with one of Z-Man's assistants as prosecutor, but the jury wasn't taking any chances, not after seeing what the figure of death could do, even though visible only to the psychic few. They acquired Paul Garneau on the first ballot. Paul made out nicely because he had bet his bottom dollar that he would be acquitted. He went about with a pose of injured innocence, gambling more extravagantly than ever. Old Miro neglected his trade and began working on a special mask and costume which he said would be his masterpiece. Then, realizing he was falling behind, he bundled it away and said nothing more. Paul knew about it, for he was keeping close watch on Miro. In his turn, Detective Blank was keeping watch on Paul. As Blank put it to his superiors, I still think that this man Garneau killed Dizzard because he needed money. If he gets in financial straits again, he may try another murder. But Paul thought he lost much. But Paul, though he lost much through reckless play, did not run out of money. During his brief prosperity, he had met a new friend, Steve Lucas, who mistook him for a man of substance and lent him cash whenever he needed it. Now a year had passed, and the Mardi Gras again was due. So were some $10,000 worth of notes that Paul had given Steve. What made it bad was that Paul had been winning lately, and now had the money, or most of it. But to pay off Steve, he would leave himself broke, and Paul couldn't do that. Instead, he became clever indeed. First, he began telling Carlota that he saw a death figure hovering over Steve, and soon Carlota began believing that she saw it too, as she had with Dizzard. Even though Carlota wasn't totally convinced, Paul did not worry. This time, things were well set. At Miro's, Paul found that the old man was still seeing his vision of the Grim Reaper as before, but was not keeping such exact records. That, too, was helpful. This year, Paul bought a very special costume representing a pirate chief, but he did not put it on at Miro's. Paul just took it along and told Carlota and the others about it, so everyone knew that come Mardi Gras, Paul Garneau would be swaggering about as a pirate chief, as he had previously swashbuckled as the laughing cavalier. Word of this reached Detective Blank. Then, towards Mardi Gras Day, When Miro's shop was all but empty, Paul stopped in one evening and confided in the old mask maker. "I have a friend who wants a special costume," said Paul. "I know you have one put away back there in the shop, and I'm sure he would pay a good price for it. How about accommodating him, Miro?" Finally, Miro agreed and named a price. Paul paid the money. "My friend is outside," Paul told Miro, "so I'll collect from him and send him in. He doesn't want to be known, so don't give him much attention. And don't mention this to anyone else, you understand?" Miro understood. Paul went out, and his friend came in, a stooped, shambling man whose face was muffled in his upturned coat collar. He went to the darkened back corner of the shop. There he straightened up and became Paul Garneau and found the special costume and put it on. When he was ready, he reverted to the shambling gait and stopped to ask in a disguised voice that he knew could not be recognized within the muffled mask, "How do I look, Mr. Miro?" Miro gave an appraising glance. Sorry, I knew it's one of those words. Glance. Miro gave an appraising glance, then tilted back his head and began a titter that became a cackle, then a laugh. He continued to laugh and laugh as Paul had never heard him laugh before. That, of course, was the best of omens, for Miro was always saddened when he saw the face of death in the offing. Okay. Paul left the shop. A block from Miro's, he phoned Carlota and told her, "Steve Lucas is expecting us at his apartment because I said we would take him to dinner with us. Poor chap, we ought to see that he has a good time before death takes him. So meet me over there right away." This being carnival time, Steve Lucas was holding open house. As Carlota walked in, Steve, a smallish man, was standing in the living room wearing a sad-faced clown costume. He was just greeting Carlota when a pair of French windows opened from a balcony behind him, and a skeleton figure of death launched into the room. Never in her wildest fancies had Carlota seen the Grim Reaper more vividly, nor had he ever shown his power so forcefully. With skeleton hands, the death figure grabbed Steve by the neck and shook him as a terrier would a rat. Steve's clown mask came off, and Carlota saw his eyes go googly, while his face began to turn blue. Realizing how deadly that clutch of death could really be, Carlota turned and raced out the front way, screaming for help. On the threshold, she ran into a man in a costume of a pirate chief, and she gasped in happy recognition. "Quickly, Paul," panted Carlota. "Steve is in there, but death is choking him. It may be too late to save him." It wasn't quite too late. Steve was still gasping when the pirate chief reached the living room and pulled an old-fashioned pistol from his sash. He aimed it at the figure of death, and to Carlota's amazement, the Grim Reaper, who should have feared no weapon, did an odd thing. He flung Steve aside, and instead of vanishing, dove for the pirate chief, trying to wrest the pistol from him. In the struggle, the gun went off. It was Death who took the bullet, for he sprawled on the floor in the full light. Carlota saw that he was not actually a skeleton figure, but that his costume consisted of bright white streaks painted on black velvet to represent ribs and other bones. His skull was a paint job too, for it came off like a loosened helmet and rolled away, revealing the face beneath. The man who had masqueraded as Death was Paul Garneau. Amazed, Carlota turned to the pirate chief, who should have been Paul. He unmasked and revealed himself as Detective Henry Blank. The situation really unraveled itself when Steve Lucas recovered sufficiently to talk. He brought out a wallet containing the notes for the cash that Paul Garneau owed him. Paul said to have these ready, Steve related, so he could pay them off instead he tried to kill me so he could steal them back, and nobody would have been the wiser. And he wore that death costume, Carlotta explained, so that this time I would be positive I saw the Grim Reaper take his toll. I knew Garneau was playing something, declared Detective Blank, so I kept watching his apartment. I heard him phone Mr. Lucas to arrange to come over. Instead, when I trailed him, he went to Miro's. I figured he planned to pick up a different costume, so I doubled back to his apartment and put on the Pirate Chief outfit. Not just to surprise him here, but because he might want it as an alibi if he ducked back to his place. But I never expected to see him in a death outfit. Later, Detective Blank talked to Miro and learned that the old mask maker had designed the death costume, hoping it would clear his mind of those visions of the Grim Reaper. It hadn't helped, so he had packed the special outfit away, but Paul Garneau had been smart enough to find it. Too smart, as it turned out. A very odd thing happened, explained Miro. I half guessed that the friend, quote-unquote, Paul sent in for the costume was Paul himself. When he asked me how he looked in the costume, he was wondering if I saw death in back of him, and I did see death so close that it could lay its hands on him. Ordinarily, that would have put me in a sad mood, and I'd have shown it. Paul knew that and was waiting for my warning nod, but when I saw death, I saw death laying his hands on death. A phantom death gripping the man who was masquerading as death. Miro gave a high-pitched cackle. It was so funny that I laughed and laughed. Ha 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 ha. Okay. And that was Death's Masquerade. Let me just check and make sure. Yep, Death's Masquerade. Now, we are going to start the Riddle of the Crypt. Ooh, this one sounds good. Let me change positions here so I can do this better. Okay. Says here. The cabin cruiser Rover had just rounded Porpoise Point when Irene Morrow gained her first view of Cliff Island. Her brother Roy, I wonder if it's Rob Roy, pointed it out as it loomed in sight, and Irene exclaimed, "How beautiful! How very, very beautiful!" It was indeed a splendid sight, a mass of steep gray bluffs rising like the walls and towers of an enchanted palace, floating on a clear blue sea. As the cruiser swung eastward of the island, the setting sun gave a scintillating touch to the granite heights, producing a scene straight from the pages of a fairy book. As the boat sped closer, the island seemed to spread in size, creating another surprising illusion. Then, suddenly, a frowning headland cut off the sunlight and darkened the water with a solemn gloom, broken only by the tufted white of waves that crashed on the cold dark stone below. In a trice, all the sparkle was gone, and the face of the island became rugged and forbidding. The transition struck Irene as she was repeating the enthusiastic words, forcing her to modify them. How very, very beautiful, and yet so weird and ghostly. In a sense, the change was fearful. The rover seemed due to crash on the rocks. But Jerry Lane, the youthful skipper, deftly swung to port, almost skirting the spray of the treacherous breakers. Dead ahead, Irene saw a cleft in the rocky wall. It widened, and sunlight streamed through the jagged gap, transforming the moody black cliffs back to their glittering gray. We are coming into Middle Harbor, shouted Roy above the tumult of the waves. Tumult. Don't let Jerry scare you. He really knows this channel. The channel followed a fold between the high crags, and after a medley of sunlight and shadow, shadows, the cruiser hummed into a cozy cove where a few dozen speedboats and cruisers were moored, alongside some trim sailboats and a motley lot of weather-beaten fishing craft. From a short pier, a gangplank ran down to the float, to a float where arriving craft could pull alongside regardless of the tide, which was heavy along this part of the New England coast. Soon, Roy and Irene were ashore with their luggage, which was handled by a lanky man in overalls whose face was as rugged as the island cliffs. He carried the bags to a car old enough to mark its owners as one of the early settlers. It bore the crude legend J. Cuppy Taxi. The settlement about the pier was a combination of fishing and tourist haven, where a post office and some stores, seafood restaurants, and fishing shacks. But the slopes that funneled up from the harbor were studded with cottages of early 20th century vintage. They were reached by zigzag roadways and paths with rock-hewn steps that served as shortcuts. I think that it's been 26. It has. Okay. We're going to stop this here. I'll start that paragraph again when we continue. We've been reading from the Riddle of the Crypt or something like that. Crypt, Riddle, something about crypts. The Legend of the Crypt. The Riddle of the Crypt. Okay. We've been reading that, and we finished off the previous one, Death's Masquerade. Okay, the Riddle of the Crypt. Not the Sphinx. Okay. So, I had to write that down to my list. Okay, so we have been reading from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural. And it was adapted by Walter B. Gibson. And, so yeah, if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, support me in any way. If you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.